For the first time ever, rideshare unions, so a union for Uber and Lyft, could be a real possibility. And I gotta be honest, I can actually see this happening. Now, here's the big thing. Massachusetts is going to be voting on question 3 later this year. And the main idea, as you can see right away, is should unions be allowed for rideshare drivers? I'm going to go down here. Question 3 asks, let me close out all these ads popping up. Question 3 asks voters whether rideshare drivers should be allowed to unionize for collective bargaining with companies such as Uber and Lyft. Now, a big settlement, and I've done a video about this, was reached in June between the state and the transportation network companies in a lawsuit originally filed by their Attorney General, Maura Healey. And basically, Healey claimed that the companies had misclassified their drivers as independent contractors rather than company employees. This is an important thing to keep in mind. So keep that in mind for a second about being an independent contractor versus being an employee. She sued the companies for backroll and unemployment taxes and to change the status of drivers to employees. And here's the issue. Employees are afforded certain benefits that are not guaranteed for independent contractors, including a minimum wage, earned paid sick time, and unemployment insurance. The state also benefits by collecting payroll taxes and money to support the state's unemployment insurance fund. And the state was able to collect $175 million to resolve allegations the companies violated in Massachusetts wage and hour laws, money that will be distributed to current and former drivers. So this is a huge deal. Even ignoring the whole union aspect of question 3 later this year, this is a huge thing that got passed. The settlement set a $32.50 minimum wage for active time, which starts when a driver accepts a fare, earn paid sick days, paid family leave, and a stipend to access healthcare and other benefits. The companies also agreed to institute an appeal process for drivers who are deactivated from their apps. So this right here, I'm going to highlight it to show you, in my opinion, is the biggest win for drivers out of anything in the entire country. Yes, there's stuff going on different places around the country, like in Minneapolis. We have Prop 22 here in California, which is a bit bittersweet. Some pros, some cons, and I'll talk about that a bit later in this video as well. But this is huge. And I've talked about this before in other videos, that you're looking at, for a lot of drivers, this unique middle ground where drivers are not employees, but they're not necessarily just independent contractors. And I've mentioned this, that it's kind of like independent contractor with benefits. It's this unique middle category that I think is being paved out just for rideshare drivers, because this kind of stuff doesn't really exist. These benefits don't really exist for almost any other profession, right? Let's be honest, right? And in addition to going down here, as you can imagine, there's been some analysis by Tisch College. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly, right? And agreements would be, like say when it comes to any kind of disagreement or agreement or situations going on, agreements would be reviewed by the state secretary of labor, who would serve as an arbiter to accept or reject proposals, amend agreements, and even change economic terms. So the biggest thing, though, is the issue of flexibility. This is why if you talk to a lot of drivers, most of them want to be independent contractors, but it is this middle ground, like I said. Most drivers don't want to be employees. And I used to think back in the day that drivers should be employees. I've now changed my stance. I now think that drivers should be independent contractors, but they should get benefits. They shouldn't be able to get screwed over like they do all the time, whether it's with paid sick leave or the amount that they get, wrongful deactivations. I mean, the list goes on, like I've talked about in so many other videos. And you can see here that the issue for most drivers is their flexibility to work when and where they can. That's by far the best benefit of Uber and Lyft and being a rideshare driver in general. For many transportation companies and similar app-based organizations as possible, that's what they want. Similar to, like, say, Uber Eats or delivery drivers, right? Many drivers log into several different applications, driving passengers as well as delivering food and other merchandise on a regular basis. And going down here, and this is where things get, I think, a bit tricky, because what's interesting is Uber and Lyft has not really opposed this. Now, when Prop 22 happened here in California, should rideshare drivers be independent contractors or employees, Uber and Lyft spent millions, I think it was tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars in ads to make sure rideshare drivers stay as independent contractors. This is a bit different. Uber and Lyft is not really opposing the union aspect, which on one end you could say, cool, they're for the union. You could argue that or not. But also you may be wondering, why is Uber and Lyft so nonchalantly easygoing about this union or potentially unions being formed when it comes to rideshare drivers? And we'll talk about that. But going here, woke question 3 raised the cost of Uber and Lyft, right? And basically, they found in Teach College analysis predicts aggressive court challenges to the law if the yes votes prevail, as well as a potential increase in the price of rides. Rideshare applications have been shown to decrease the incidence of drunken driving and offer means of accessible transportation in areas lacking to transport options and rural areas. So it could be that in Massachusetts, if unions do get formed, the price of Ubers and Lyfts could potentially go up, right? But just kind of showing you kind of pros and cons, it has been shown that as a result of Ubers and Lyfts, it's been a lot easier for people to get around. Like say if you don't have a car, take here in LA. In Boston, for example, you can take the T or the metro or the subway. But here in LA, you kind of need a car. But Uber and Lyft makes that a lot easier. Of course, reducing DUIs. I mean, when people go out now, it's very common. Just be like, hey, get an Uber or Lyft. You're drinking. Be safe, right? Be safe. And of course, there are some kind of things going against this, right? So I'm going to switch now to a different article. And you can see right here right away that it's criticized for creating gig worker company unions. Uber and Lyft, like I said earlier, so we're going to touch upon this now, are not opposing question 3, but it would keep drivers as independent contractors without full labor protections. This is where I think things are not going to be fully perfect. And I think that this is one of those situations, I'm going to be honest, as we get into this article, or if I'm going to briefly kind of go through, that it's one of those situations where if you don't know the full story, I can see this criticism. But I think if you do, I actually don't think it's as warranted. I'm going to be honest. I actually slightly disagree with this article, but might as well mention it. So going down here, typically industry would fight tooth and nail against a new state law, making it easier for their workers to collectively bargain, right? And they just brought this up with Uber and Lyft, talking about Prop 22. They spent, there it is, $222 million for Prop 22 to keep drivers as independent contractors. In Massachusetts, rideshare apps are publicly saying they won't oppose being a union, right? Like I said, question 3, which allows drivers to at least nominally form a union. The company's tacit support is likely because the law would give workers a mere vitissimo of bargaining rights without officially changing their designated status as independent contractors. And this is where it gets kind of tricky, and I'm going to talk about this in a second. This misclassification is how tech companies like Uber and Lyft skirt federal labor laws to avoid providing workers with the benefits and protections of full-time employees. That is the main kind of overarching theme of this article, where it's basically saying, okay, the reason why they're for this is because part of this kind of thing of them being able to form a union and being in unions actually encourages and pigeonholes the drivers more as being independent contractors. Now, first off, I might as well say this, I'm for this. I'm for, of course, unions for rideshare drivers. So if I was in Massachusetts, which I'm not, I'm in California, but if I was in Massachusetts, I'd vote yes for this to make sure that rideshare drivers can form unions. And I get on one end maybe some of the criticism saying, well, you know, with this bill being passed, like it's gonna be easier for Uber drivers and Lyft drivers to be pigeonholed as independent contractors when they should be employees. And I can see at first glance some people looking at it from that perspective, saying, hey, you know, I just don't get this. Like I heard rideshare drivers get taken advantage of. Uber and Lyft is these big conglomerate companies that take advantage of all their drivers. And yes, that does happen. Don't get me wrong, with a lot of different reasons and in a lot of different ways I've talked about in a lot of videos on this channel. But here's the truth. Yeah, well, of course, things are never going to be perfect. I think forming a union within the independent contractor realm is the best way to go because, like I said, most drivers don't want to be classified as employees. Like I showed you, the biggest benefit of being an Uber driver and a Lyft driver is the flexible schedule. Now, I do want to be honest. If, let's say, Uber drivers and Lyft drivers and rideshare drivers did get classified as employees and they were set in stone as that, let's say, in Massachusetts, do I think the apps could figure out a way to still make it flexible for drivers? I'd say yes. Now, how do they go about that? I honestly don't know. I genuinely don't know. But I feel like that is 90% of the reason why most people sign up to be an Uber driver and a Lyft driver, right? It's the closest thing to being your own boss without being your own boss. And with that being said, throughout the years, as we all know, things have gotten worse and worse for rideshare drivers. And it's kind of tricky because a lot of rideshare drivers are like, hey, I do love driving. I can drive whenever I want. I can attend my daughter's dance recital. I can, go on a vacation and not ask my boss for time off. I have a 9-to-5 job and I want to make a secondary source of income, but it's kind of tricky getting another job and putting that into my schedule. Boom, I drive for Uber and Lyft. And that's why most people want to stay as independent contractors. However, like I've talked about in a lot of other videos, you have employees, independent contractors, and I think rideshare driving really is this middle ground now that's being paved with being an independent contractor with benefits. In a funny way, and I've said this analogy before, I look at it kind of similar to like a relationship where you're either in a relationship or you're friends with benefits. That's kind of what's happening with rideshare driving right now. And I think it's becoming more and more common for, I think, a lot of legislation, lawmakers, et cetera, saying, okay, you know what, rideshare drivers are kind of in their own unique category, and they really are. For example, when AB 5 passed here in California, AB 5, in case you didn't know, was a bill that basically helped out a lot of independent contractors, freelance workers here in California for rights and protections. The only exception, the only field, the only industry that got the exception to AB 5, as you can guess, is rideshare driving, and that's what was Prop 22. That's what Prop 22 did. And again, there's pros and cons to what happened after Prop 22, whole other subject for a whole other video. But at the end of the day, most drivers want to be independent contractors. So that's why I want to address this kind of criticism of people saying, oh man, but part of this kind of question 3, if they are able to unionize, is it does kind of pigeonhole them more. If you look at a spectrum of independent contractor versus employee, it's a bit gray right now in Massachusetts, given what already happened with now drivers getting things like paid sick leave, wrongful deactivations being more kind of pursued, the fact that they can get unemployment assistance, right? The fact that they get a minimum hourly wage. There's a lot of things happening for rideshare drivers in Massachusetts, and it's now in this gray area. Are you an independent contractor or are you an employee? But after this, it seems like you're pigeonholing drivers more as independent contractors. But here's the thing. That's what most drivers want. It is the best of both worlds. I will also say, and I think this is why for Uber and Lyft, they're not opposing this. Not the way they did here in California, because with California, the reason why they spent, $222 million is because it would put rideshare drivers as employees. And that would be really bad for, I think, both drivers and also Uber and Lyft. I think most drivers don't agree with Uber and Lyft in a lot of ways. But I think the one thing they can agree on is like a Venn diagram, the small sliver of things they agree on, is the fact that most drivers want to be independent contractors. Same thing with Uber and Lyft. And I think the reason why Uber and Lyft is not opposing this is because they're like, hey, it's kind of a win for us. Drivers are now being pigeonholed more as independent contractors, and we want them to stay as such. But for drivers, I also think this is a win because you're like, hey, not only are we staying as independent contractors, we don't want to be employees. We like the flexible schedule. But now we have benefits. Now we have protections. Now we have minimum wages, et cetera, et cetera. And now on top of that, we could potentially now have unions for even greater protection. I think this is a massive win for drivers and for Uber and Lyft. And I think very rarely do you see a situation like this when it comes to the ride-sharing world and the ride-sharing landscape, which is very tricky and very rocky. And I've done so many videos about all the juice and the drama in the ride-sharing world. This is one of the few situations that I think is a win-win because Uber and Lyft is like, hey, this helps us now not worry about drivers being classified as employees. It kind of shoves them more towards this independent contractor route. But also for drivers, they're like, hey, we're now being more pigeonholed as independent contractors, which is what we want, and we're getting protections, and now we can have unions. And this is a huge first step. This is why I said before when everything happened in Massachusetts earlier this year that Massachusetts is which is kind of ironic because obviously that's why I started driving. I started driving in Boston almost a decade ago, which is kind of crazy to say. Massachusetts is leading the way now for rideshare drivers. I think this is monumental. Not only what happened earlier in the year, which is already monumental, but now to have the first state to actually have unions for rideshare drivers, this could be game changing, right? And I think it is like I said before, looking at this spectrum, I feel like I'm doing a lot with my hands right now, but looking at the spectrum, it is paving more and more down the way this unique path of being an independent contractor with benefits. And I know I keep saying that almost like a broken record, but that's really important to mention that it is the perfect middle ground, I think, for both Uber, Lyft, and also for drivers, that they say it's independent contractors, which is great for everybody, but also they're not being hung out to dry. And this does happen with a lot of independent contractors, because if you look at a lot of industries, take here in California before AB5, if you were an independent contractor or a freelance worker, you could get screwed over like that. Super easy. And with rideshare drivers, even though they are independent contractors, maybe by nature in a sense, there is a hint of employee-ness, if that's a word, in terms of what they do, in terms of the protections they should be getting. And I think this is huge for drivers in Massachusetts. This could be, honestly, already what happened over this year was legendary for rideshare drivers. One of the biggest news stories maybe ever for a big W, for a big win for drivers. But later this year, when people vote on the ballot, and I can see, if I had to guess, I can see question three actually creating unions. I can see this passing. I can see unions actually being a thing later this year, and only a couple months now from the time of this video. Having unions in Massachusetts would be one of the biggest wins for rideshare drivers ever.